Sawadee-ka. Hello and welcome to Daily Wisdom, Walking the Path with the Buddha. Today is our Pali Canon and English study group, and we're in Volume 12, which is titled Lowly Arts. We're going to be studying chapters 41 through 50. This particular book shares a lot of different teachings really guided towards the ordained practitioners, but there's a lot of teachings in here for household practitioners as well that you can learn and develop and understand and then practice in order to be able to make your way closer and closer to enlightenment. So I'd like to welcome you, whether you're joining for the first time or you've been joining regularly. This particular class is more of a study group versus a traditional style of learning where I'll be teaching for maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes and then opening up to questions and teaching some more and, opening up to questions. Instead, what we do here is I invite people who are in Zoom to read a chapter if you would like to read one of the chapters. And then I share some teachings on that. And then I open up to any and all questions that you guys have, whether you're in Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom. You can ask your questions by putting those into the comment section. Or if you're in Zoom, you can electronically raise your hand and ask any questions or follow-up questions directly. So I'm going to switch over and use the visual aids here to be able to display the book. And then we'll just go forward in our class here. So this first chapter is chapter 41. Remember, this is volume 12. We've been in this book for a while. We're actually going to be restarting the whole program again from the beginning in July because it's been a year and a half that we've essentially been in this program sharing the teachings. So in July, we'll be restarting from volume 12. From volume 2 because we're starting from the very beginning of the volume 2 through 13 series. So here we're in chapter 41, and this one is titled Misunderstanding Regarding Listening to the Great Birth Sermon. So here, this one is titled An Arahant, Fully Enlightened Buddha Named Maitreya by the Words of the Buddha. The words of the Buddha in the Pali Canon illustrates the arising of an Arahant, fully enlightened Buddha named Maitreya that states, and in the time of the people with an 80,000 year lifespan, there will arise in the world a fortunate one, an Arahant, fully enlightened Buddha, named Maitreya, endowed with wisdom and conduct, a welfarer, knower of the worlds, incomparable trainer of men to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, enlightened and fortunate, just as I am now. He will thoroughly know, having realized it by his own experience, and proclaim this universe with its heavenly beings and Maras and Brahmas, its ascetics and Brahmins, and this generation with its princes and people, just as I do now. He will teach the teachings lovely in its beginning, lovely in its middle, lovely in its end, in the spirit and in the letter, and proclaim, just as I do now, the holy life in its in its fullness and purity. He will be attended by a company of thousands of monks, just as I am attended by a company of hundreds. This was all the words of the Buddha mentioned in the Pali Canon regarding the Arahant, fully enlightened Buddha named Maitreya. So here, this is from the Buddha where he's describing this new Buddha that is going to come into the world. There's other canons out there in the world that have collections of teachings of the Buddha besides the Pali Canon. It's the Pali Canon that's considered to be the largest, most complete collection of the teachings of the Buddha. It's 45 large volumes that are very thick. And this is where the source teachings of the Buddha are from. And then there's other canons as well that have other kind of miscellaneous things that maybe might not have made their way through the 2,500 years of the Pali Canon, but instead are showing up in other places. So here, what you're seeing is the Buddha talking about this enlightened Buddha that's coming into the world, but you can find some other teachings in other places where he gives an actual time frame of when this Buddha is to arise. And he gives this 500-year cycles, which dates the arising of this Buddha to 2017, because the Buddha died in 483 BCE, and the Buddha basically shared in these other teachings that it would be 2,500 years from his death that this new Buddha would arise. And here, what you're seeing from the Buddha is he's referring to this individual as Maitreya. What the word Maitreya means is metta, and this in Pali means loving kindness. This Buddha named Maitreya is thought to have a significant amount of loving kindness, which is a genuine interest in seeing all beings be well, active goodwill towards all beings. Because in order to arise as a Buddha and get to enlightenment on your own, and then dedicate the rest of your life to sharing those teachings and then preserve them for others to get to enlightenment, it takes a significant amount of loving kindness and compassion for the world to be able to do that. So here the Buddha is referring to this Buddha as Maitreya. And here you can see the Buddha is talking about a lifespan of 80,000 years. What he's talking about is that as Maitreya arises in the world, starting in 2017, that from that point forward, the world would have another 80,000 years before the end of humanity, essentially. So this is what the Buddha is referring to when he says the people with an 80,000 year lifespan. It's not that one individual could ever live for 80,000 years. It's just not possible. It's talking about all of humanity. And this fully perfectly enlightened Buddha named Maitreya would be endowed with wisdom in this moral conduct, be able to share the teachings that would help others to be able to get to enlightenment. And the Buddha describes this here as this person would be able to share teachings that are lovely in the beginning, the middle, and the end, because this is the way that the Buddha taught, is that he taught that when you're sharing teachings, that it shouldn't start off really great in a particular class and then kind of die off, or you shouldn't start off kind of lackluster and kind of build and then fade off. Instead, he shares with people who are interested in teaching that you should teach where it's good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, so that the students can maintain their attention and have interest in actually learning the teachings. Whereas if you kind of fade it as a teacher over the time of your course, this would be very unwise, because people would get uninterested, become disinterested in what it is that you're actually sharing. The Buddha shares here that as he's attended to by hundreds of monks, that Maitreya would have thousands of monks that would be learning and practicing with him, along with household practitioners too, of course. So here the Buddha is just kind of helping people to know that there is a Buddha after him, because the Buddha knew that his teachings were going to reach the entire world, but it just wouldn't be during his lifetime. Because at the time of the life of Gotama Buddha, the world didn't have the certain things that were needed in order to have the teaching spread throughout the entire world. The world had many different languages at that time, and the language that the Buddha spoke in wasn't understood widely by the entire world. So it was impossible for the teachings to spread during that lifetime. So we have three criteria that exist now that didn't exist during the lifetime of the Buddha that makes this a perfect time for Maitreya to arise in the world and share his teachings worldwide. One is we have an international language of English, that all throughout the world we're speaking one common language, and more people are learning English all the time. The second thing is that we have travel, that you can travel throughout the world. During the lifetime of the Buddha, it was very hard to travel. Nowadays, we can be from one end of the earth to another end of the earth in essentially 24 to 48 hours. And then the third thing is the internet has made it very easy to send material, resources, and content all throughout the world. Like right now, wherever you're listening to this, whether you're live in any particular part of the world or you're listening to this on the replay, you're not physically here in Thailand with me, which during the lifetime of the Buddha, in order to learn, you would have needed to physically be sitting with the Buddha in order to learn and know that language. Where now we have the ability through the internet to send content all throughout the world with the pressing of a button, whether it's a book, an audiobook, a live stream like this, or a video or something like that. We can send the teachings of the Buddha all throughout the world. So Maitreya would be able to have many, many more students than during the lifetime of the Buddha, because of these three particular conditions and criteria that exist today that didn't exist during the lifetime of the Buddha. So here the Buddha is just describing this new Buddha so that people would be aware that this individual is coming into the world. But to be able to actually identify a Buddha, it's very rare for somebody to know how to do that. Even for the unenlightened mind to be able to identify someone who's enlightened is very challenging for the unenlightened mind to do that, let alone identify an actual Buddha. But it is possible. And here in Thailand, people know how to identify an enlightened being. They also know how to identify a Buddha as well. And these are skills and wisdom that people have and have acquired over their lifetime and over many generations. So it's possible for this to occur. But a Buddha isn't going to be interested in the world at large, understanding that he's arisen in the world. So any Buddha that would arise in 2017 and start appearing in the world, they wouldn't go on the news and kind of make an announcement that they're, awake and that they're enlightened and, come learn with me now. Instead, a Buddha isn't interested in fame or fortune or anything like that. They're only interested in helping others get to enlightenment. And that's what's ultimately going to preserve the teachings for future generations. Nowadays, we have books and videos and podcasts and audiobooks and things like this. But the best thing to preserve the teachings long into the future is countless people getting to enlightenment. By that wisdom being in the mind of an individual who gets to enlightenment, they will never forget the wisdom that it took for them to get to enlightenment. And it will be shared with other people as well. So now with English, with easy travel, with internet being accessible, we can share the teachings worldwide, and the whole world can then learn the teachings of the Buddha, and we can restore these teachings back into the world. So this is the Buddha talking about this new Buddha named Maitreya that he referred to as Maitreya, as having lots of loving kindness. So does anybody have any questions on this? You can put this in Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into the next chapter. These chapters here, there's a whole series of them. By the way, here in the comment section, you can see where I'm sharing reflections on what is a Buddha. Why will Maitreya Buddha not share with the public that he is a Buddha? There's things like this that you can read here. If you haven't read this, there's quite a bit of content that you can read on each one of these chapters. But these first few chapters here in this series of 41 through 50, there's these misunderstandings. And what I'm going to do, rather than reading the content that's here, because this content isn't the actual words of the Buddha, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you understand what this is describing, and then you can read it on your own if you like. This misunderstanding is related to the transference of merit. And for those of you guys that have studied with me in the group learning program, we talked about this when we talked about the misunderstandings related to the teachings of the Buddha. What merit is when you're making an offering to an ordained practitioner, to a teacher, to a temple, for the continuation of the teachings of the Buddha. It's helping you by practicing generosity. It's training your mind to let go. But it's also helping the teachings of the Buddha to be shared in the world and help other people to access the teachings and get access to what they need in order to get to enlightenment and eliminate their discontent feelings. So this is very helpful to be able to practice where you're practicing generosity. It's helping your mind. But there's this misunderstanding in the world that some places you go, quite a few actually, once you make an offering, they will have you get this little urn of water, and they will have you pour out this water as they're chanting. And what they think is that you're transferring the benefits of your merit to somebody else. But if you understand the benefits of generosity, it's not possible to transfer that to anybody else, because the benefits of generosity is that your mind is being trained to let go, that you're eliminating craving, desire, attachment. So you can't transfer that benefit to somebody else. So if mom or dad or brothers and sisters are, doing unwholesome things in the world and they die, it's not possible for you to do a whole bunch of good things like practicing merit and then pour out this water and transfer it to other people. So this is a right ritual ceremony and worship, which is what the Buddha didn't actually teach. And if you learn the natural law of karma based on the words of the Buddha, he shares with you that beings are the owners, heirs of their karma. Whatever karma they do, wholesome or unwholesome, they are its heirs, meaning that you are producing your own karma. Nobody else can produce karma for you. So here there's this big misunderstanding throughout Buddhist communities where they pour this water and they think that they're transferring this merit to another person. So here this is explaining the origin of that and where that's coming from. So this isn't the words of the Buddha, because the Buddha didn't teach this. But this particular book, there's authors and there's people who researched this and figured out exactly where this misunderstanding came from. And then as you go through, you can actually see the references of where they discovered this and how this misunderstanding came into being with the population of Buddhist practitioners. Then chapter 43 is a misunderstanding regarding holy water. What this is by the way, the first one that I just mentioned, is called Guatnam, where they pour out this water. In Thai, we call it Guatnam. This one here we call Namun, where there's a bowl, and as the ordained practitioners are chanting, they will light a candle and they will drip water into this bowl, and they think that they've made this water special because they've been chanting and dripping wax into the water, but there's nothing special that's happening there. It's just water. And then what they will do is they'll take kind of the end of what looks like a broom, but it's not, and they'll dip it into the water and they'll sprinkle it on people. And the belief is that it purifies you, right? And that this is some kind of holy water. But you can't go out into the world, do a bunch of unwholesome things, and just have somebody sprinkle some water on you. This ordained practitioner is just like any other person. We're all regular people. This person doesn't have any anointed special power that by chanting and dripping wax into water and sprinkling that on you, that miraculously that you're going to experience some kind of benefit. These are promoting what's referred to as wrong view, that the mind doesn't understand that the real problem is the lack of wisdom in your own mind, and that making unwise decisions in the world is producing unwholesome results. And the solution is to cultivate wisdom so that then you can go out into the world and train your mind and make wise decisions that lead to wholesome results. So the Buddha describes very clearly in his teachings in this book, you can see the chapters where he talks about how he doesn't practice the sprinkling of this holy water, the consecration or blessing of any kind of land or anything like this. But nowadays, 2,500 years later, we have countless people who are misunderstanding his teachings, and they're doing these kinds of things, and they're being led off the path to enlightenment. They're being misled. And this is unfortunate because those people could otherwise be learning with the original words of the Buddha, and then they'll be able to see what the true teachings are and then be able to make real progress on the path. But as long as they're showing up to places where they are just getting sprinkled with holy water, they're not really understanding the true problem in the mind, which is this lack of wisdom and needing to cultivate wisdom in the mind. So this is explaining where that's coming from and giving you the resources to understand where the references are from. Then there's a misunderstanding here regarding chanting or reciting of the teachings. During the lifetime of the Buddha, they chanted in order to commit the teachings to memory, that he would speak in an oral tradition, and then every 2 weeks they would chant and commit the teachings to memory. Where nowadays we have books and audiobooks and videos and podcasts and things like this to commit them down in a place that can be preserved. But during the lifetime of the Buddha, he didn't have that available to him. The technology that existed in order to write things down, it was in China, but it hadn't made its way to the region of the world where the Buddha was. So the language that he spoke, it wasn't even a language that had a script, because they didn't have a reason for a script, because they didn't have any way to write things down. So everything they did was oral. So they chanted as a way to commit the teachings to memory. So nowadays, people 2,500 years later, they're thinking that these chants have some kind of mystical or magical benefit. And oftentimes it's because they don't know what the words actually mean, but it's also part of wrong view. So if you understand that chanting was used just to commit the teachings to memory and it wasn't used for any other purpose, then you understand that the Buddha didn't teach rites and rituals and ceremonies. He didn't teach mysterious and magical things. He didn't teach superstition and auspicious things. He taught to learn, reflect, to independently verify, and practice. So here, this is explaining to you the misunderstandings around chanting. And just like I teach you guys not to believe anything in the world, but to learn it, reflect on it, and practice it to independently verify it, don't believe me either. If you go into an environment where a particular temple says, hey, we've got this secret chant that only our temple knows about, and if you come to our temple, every single day or every single week and you chant this particular chant, you're going to get an extra long life, or you're going to get more wealthy, or you're going to get your boyfriend or girlfriend back, or something like this. If this was true, you'd be able to see the evidence of that. That's how you independently verify something. So if somebody says, hey, chant this extra special chant, that it's a secret chant that only our temple knows, you can get an extra long life. Well, you should see a bunch of 150, 200, 300-year-old people at that temple. And if you don't see that, then you know that this isn't true. It's just a belief that people have. Or you can look at it this way, that if there was truly something like that, where you could chant something and you get this extra long life, or you'd get wealthy or rich, or you would get your boyfriend or girlfriend back immediately by chanting this thing, then that would have spread like wildfire throughout humanity. It wouldn't be able to be kept a secret because people would be sharing it like crazy with everybody, because everybody would be interested in those kinds of things. So it's not possible to just chant things and then magically something's going to appear in your life. You can't bring something into fruition. You can't manifest something in your life by just chanting or thinking about it. You need to put action behind any particular thing that you're looking to accomplish. And your actions need to come from your wisdom. So as you have wisdom and you make wise decisions about certain actions and things that you're doing, this will lead to certain results. If you're making wise decisions, it will lead to wholesome results. If you're making unwise decisions, it'll lead to unwholesome results. It's not pouring out water into a little urn. It's not sprinkling water on you. It's not chanting that's going to lead to wisdom. So none of these things were actually practiced by the Buddha in order to improve the condition of the mind, because it just doesn't work. And it's not part of the true teachings. But you'll see lots of people talking about these things or doing these things. So in this book series, there's information in volume 1, and there's information here helping you to understand some of those misunderstandings. So if you guys have questions on any of these, you can let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to chapter 45, but I would like to pause and see if you guys have any questions on these misunderstandings before I go forward into the rest of the chapters for today. All right, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So I'm going to move into chapter 45 here. This one's titled, Reside with the Teachings as Your Refuge. These are the words of the Buddha. But have I not already declared, Ananda, that we must be parted, separated, and severed from all who are dear and agreeable to us? How, Ananda, is it to be obtained here? May what is born come to be conditioned in subject to disintegration, not disintegrate. That is impossible. Therefore, Ananda, reside with yourselves as your own refuge, reside with yourselves as your own island, with yourselves as your own refuge, with no other refuge. Reside with the teachings as your island, with the teachings as your refuge, with no other refuge. And how, Ananda, does a monk reside with himself as his own island, with himself as his own refuge, with no other refuge, with the teachings as his island, with the teachings as his refuge, with no other refuge? Here, Ananda, a monk resides reflecting on the body as body. He resides reflecting on feelings as feelings. He resides reflecting on mind as mind. He resides reflecting on mental objects as mental objects, dedicated, clearly aware, clearly comprehending, mindful, having removed craving and displeasure in regard to the world. Those monks, Ananda, either now or after I am gone, who reside with themselves as their own island, with themselves as their own refuge, with no other refuge, who reside with the teachings as their island, with the teachings as their refuge, with no other refuge. It is these monks, Ananda, who will be for me greatest of those dedicated to the training. Okay, so let me give you some context of where this discourse is coming from and what was going on in the life of the Buddha while he was giving this discourse. The Buddha was so enlightened and so awake that he knew that he was going to die before he actually died. He knew 3 months ahead of time that he was going to die. So he gave a heads up to his students that he was going to die in 3 months. And this is really wise for a Buddha to do, because if you can imagine the countless people that were around the Buddha by the time he was dying and he was going to die, that he would have just had countless students that were learning with him. And some of those students weren't enlightened, right? There were certain students who were enlightened and certain students who weren't. And the students who weren't enlightened would be the ones that were around him the most, probably. And those individuals could easily get attached to their teacher. And if you're attached to your teacher, you're not going to be able to get to enlightenment. So when the Buddha kind of declared to his students that, hey, I'm going to be dying in 3 months, this particular student, Ananda, spoke up and begged and pleaded with the Buddha not to die because he was attached to the Buddha. Ananda was a student of the Buddha from pretty much the very beginning of his teaching career at the age of 35, all the way through until he was 80 when he died, which was 45 years. So Ananda was kind of right there by his side. It's reported that Ananda was probably his brother-in-law or a cousin. He was a member of the royal family, and he joined the Buddha. And Ananda actually got to enlightenment after the death of the Buddha, because sometimes it requires the death of a loved one in order to eliminate your attachment to him. Not always. There's ways to eliminate attachment to somebody without them actually dying. But in this case, Ananda's attachment to the Buddha was holding on and still there all those years. And it wasn't until after the Buddha died that he actually got to enlightenment. So he never got to enlightenment during the lifetime of the Buddha. But having gotten to enlightenment and been with the Buddha for so long, he had this deep memory of the teachings, so that when it was time to write down the teachings shortly after the death of the Buddha, it was Ananda that was credited for having remembered them the closest. And that's why we see Ananda's name in a lot of the discourses, because out of the 500 enlightened beings that came together after the death of the Buddha, it was Ananda who was kind of giving most of the content for what would be documented as being the teachings of the Buddha. Once you get to enlightenment, you're not going to ever unlearn the teachings that it took for you to get there. You will always remember those teachings that it took for you to get to enlightenment. So not only were these 500 beings enlightened, not only did they have a deep memory, but because they were enlightened and had a deep memory, they would have had deep wisdom about the teachings, and they're not interested in changing them. So what they wrote down and what they documented is what the Buddha actually taught. But here, Ananda was begging and pleading with the Buddha to not die. And that's why the Buddha says, "But have I not already declared, Ananda, that we must be parted, separated, and severed from all who are dear and agreeable to us? How, Ananda, is it to be obtained here? May what is born come to be conditioned and subject to disintegration, not disintegrate. That is impossible." So what he's saying is, how can it be that I am not impermanent? I've already declared to you, Ananda, that all these conditioned objects are impermanent. Whatever's born, it's going to die. Whatever arises is going to change and fade away. Every single one of us are going to die. So even though Ananda had studied with the Buddha for all this time, of course, he understood a lot of the teachings, and he probably understood impermanence too, but he just wasn't applying it in this situation with the Buddha. It had slipped his mind. He was attached to the Buddha. So then the Buddha gives Ananda some guidance, because he's kind of like grieving a little bit that the Buddha is going to die. He says, "Therefore, Ananda, reside with yourselves as your own island, with yourselves as your own refuge, with no other refuge. Reside with the teachings as your island, with the teachings as your refuge, with no other refuge." What he's saying here is, hey, you are your own independent practitioner. You're on your own independent journey to enlightenment. The teachings are going to be what protects your mind. The wisdom that you will cultivate regarding the teachings, that's what's going to protect you, because a refuge is protection. And he's saying, okay, dwell or reside with yourself as your own island. You are your own practitioner, and as your own refuge, as your own protection. Don't be dependent and attached to other people to save you from things, but instead use your wisdom to make wise decisions. That's what's going to truly protect you. There's some other teachings that the Buddha shares where he talks about when people are really scared in a particular town and fearful, they might retreat to the mountains. Like today, maybe if something happened in a city, like maybe there was a terrorist attack, people would run and scurry and hurry away to the mountains perhaps, and they would try to get out of the city, right? Well, what the Buddha taught in this other teaching is like, that isn't going to save you. That isn't going to protect you. That running to the mountain, running to tree shrines, like maybe today we might run to a cabin in the mountains. That's not going to protect you, because you're taking your mind with you, and your mind is going to have thoughts that invade you. So the way that you protect yourself, or even though there is no self, the way you protect this being in this mind is you learn and practice the teachings. That's the real thing that's going to protect you, because by cultivating wisdom, you can make wise decisions. And that's what the Buddha is describing here. And then he says, okay, well, how do you reside with yourself as your own island, in the teachings as your own island, with yourself in the teachings as your refuge and your protection? He says, practice the 4 foundations of mindfulness. That's what he's describing here. For those of you guys that have studied the 4 foundations of mindfulness with me, you know about the bodily sensations, the feelings, the condition of the mind, and the mental objects. What he's describing is that when discontentedness is arising based on craving, desire, attachment, cut it off at the bodily sensations. That's what you need to do in order to protect the mind. This is how you guard the mind. The Buddha refers to the 4 foundations of mindfulness and mindfulness in general as a guard or as a protection. That's what's going to ultimately protect your mind, by cutting things off as a bodily sensation. And then you protect the mind that it doesn't experience this feeling of anger or guilt or shame or loneliness or boredom or jealousy or resentment or anything like that. So the more you train in these teachings with breathing, mindfulness, meditation, and generosity, you'll get to a point where your mind's fully protected. You'll be able to notice those bodily sensations, cut them off and let them go, and there won't be any more cravings in your mind, and there won't be any arising of discontentedness because you've eliminated the causes and conditions that are producing it. So then finally the Buddha sums this up where he says, okay, once I've died, anybody who's dedicated to the teachings and actually practices them, they are the greatest ones for me, because the interest of a Buddha is to preserve the teachings for future generations to be able to get to enlightenment. So the best way to preserve the teachings is for other people to get to enlightenment. A Buddha getting to enlightenment is wonderful, but if other people aren't getting to enlightenment and they don't have the wisdom to continue forward after the death of the Buddha, then it's pointless, right? A Buddha isn't interested in just them being enlightened and going around and gloating about that, right? A Buddha doesn't have arrogance and pride. They're not going to go around and be arrogant and gloating about the fact that they're enlightened. They're interested in seeing other people get to enlightenment so that wisdom can be in the hearts and in the minds of individuals that are here in the world. Of course, wisdom only exists in the mind, but by saying it's in the heart and the minds of people, this is kind of showing that warmth and connection to a teacher like Gautama Buddha, that it's wonderful for a Buddha to come into the world and share the teachings that's going to help all of humanity to be able to now get liberated and experience the enlightened mental state where the mind can be peaceful and joyful. So let me know if you guys have questions about this chapter here. I see Tonka has a question. If you'd like to go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Teacher David. I was thinking a little bit about the difference between living being and the being, because human beings obviously have the body, and then, for example, heavenly beings, they don't have a body. So does it mean they wouldn't have sensations and they wouldn't be able to cut off the arising discontentedness on that level? Like just the difference between living being and the being. So any other being that doesn't have a form wouldn't be a living being, and it would still be a temporary existence, right? Even though they can't be killed if they don't have a body. So I'm trying to kind of understand the difference between living beings and the beings, especially in regard when it comes to 4 foundations of mindfulness.
Yeah, in my opinion, the 4 foundations of mindfulness don't fully apply to a formless being because, as you say, they don't have the bodily, they don't have physical form, but there's a formless being there that they have the consciousness, they have the mind. And I suspect that there's some indication that they're about to become discontent, whether they can, even though they maybe don't have a physical body, there's that formless being there that perhaps there's some indication to them, some early warning system, just like we have in the human realm. But I can't speak on that directly because I have very minimal memories of being in the heavenly realm, same thing as being in the hell realm. I know that I was in these realms and I do have understanding of those realms, but I don't have, intricate details about every single aspect of that particular realm and that existence. I just have some general understanding of the things that I experienced when I was in those realms.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Let me see what else we have here, maybe on Facebook or YouTube. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions anywhere else. So let's move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 46. This one is titled 4 Criteria That Assure the Words of the Buddha. This is going to be a discourse that helps you to ensure that you know that you're studying with the original words of the Buddha, because there's been 2,500 years of impermanence, and you would like to cut through that and be able to see how to ensure that what you're learning is the actual words of the Buddha. So here the Buddha shares this. Suppose a monk were to say, "Friends, I heard and received this from the perfectly enlightened one's own lips. These are the teachings. This is the discipline. This is the master's teaching. Then, monks, you should neither approve nor disapprove his words. Then, without approving or disapproving his words and expressions, should be carefully noted and compared with the suttas or discourses and reviewed in the light of the discipline. If they, on such comparison and review, are found not to conform to the suttas or discourses or the discipline, the conclusion must be, assuredly, this is not the word of the Buddha. It has been wrongly understood by this monk, and the matter is to be ignored. But where on such comparison and review they are found to conform to the suttas or discourses or the discipline, the conclusion must be, assuredly, this is the word of the Buddha. It has been rightly understood by this monk. Suppose a monk were to say, in such a place, there is a community with elders and distinguished teachers. I have heard and received this from that community. Then, monks, you should neither approve nor disapprove his words. Suppose a monk were to say, in such a place, there are many elders who are learned, bearers of the tradition, who know the teachings, the discipline, the training guidance. Suppose a monk were to say, in such a place, there is one elder who is learned. I have heard and received this from that elder. But where on such comparison and review, they are found to conform to the suttas, discourses, and the discipline, then the conclusion must be, assuredly, this is the word of the Buddha. It has been rightly understood by this monk. So what the Buddha is saying here is he's saying, if you hear from other people that they're saying, hey, this is the teachings of the Buddha, whether it's from a monk or whether it's from a community elder, you should compare that to his own words, to the suttas, to the discourses. And when you compare it to the discourses, if it's not what the Buddha actually taught, he's saying ignore that. You should consider that this person has misunderstood the teachings. But when you compare that teaching to the original words of the Buddha and it matches, then you should understand that, okay, this person has understood the teachings. So this is why I base everything that I share in the words of the Buddha. And then I give you the reference so that you can go back and actually see where this comes from so that you can have confidence that what you're learning is the original words of the Buddha. But then I teach you not to believe these words, that you instead learn, reflect, independently verify, and practice. And there you can see the truth for yourself of what the actual natural laws of existence are. And then as you're applying them to your life, you can see the mind becoming more peaceful and more joyful as the qualities of enlightenment are starting to shine through. So the Buddha is teaching you how to cut through all this impermanence that has happened since his lifetime, because he knew there was going to be impermanence from the time that he died. In that point forward, he talks about these 500-year cycles that the world would go through. He talked about the first 500 years would be when many people would be getting to enlightenment after his death. The second 500 years, people would be really strong in meditation. The third 500 years, there would be scholars writing about his teachings and trying to kind of talk about what it is that he actually taught. The fourth 500 years, people would be really good with generosity and practicing generosity to support his teachings. And then the fifth 500 years, he said people would be utterly confused about what he taught, and they would be arguing and fighting amongst themselves. Ordained practitioners and household practitioners would be confused and arguing and fighting about what he actually taught. And that's where he said, okay, this new Buddha, Maitreya Buddha, would arise in the world and come in and restore his teachings back into the world, is what he basically shared. But here, he's giving you guidance on how to cut through that impermanence so that you don't believe anything that anybody shares with you. So if you see like a Facebook meme or on Instagram or some social media where someone's attributing something to the Buddha, 99.9% of those are all false. I've looked at those many, many times, and people will oftentimes put a quote and then they'll put the Buddha, attributing it to him, kind of giving it some authority or authenticity or credibility. But in reality, if you research those things, 99.9% of them aren't even the actual words of the Buddha. If you study with the original words of the Buddha and you see how he talks in his kind of personality and the way that he describes things, when you see people attributing certain words to him, you'll know that the Buddha doesn't even speak that way. You'll know yourself that they're not the original words of the Buddha, but you can actually research some of these and you can see for yourself. So here the Buddha is helping students because he knew that impermanence was going to happen and you were going to need some guidance on how to figure out whether people are actually sharing his original teachings or not. And then even if you compare it and you see that, yes, this person shared this, and I'm comparing it to the discourses and it's the same, still in that situation, you don't believe it. You learn it, you reflect on it, and you practice it. And that's what's going to lead to wisdom and awakening of your mind. So let me know what questions you guys have here. Again, you can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or raise your hand in Zoom. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. Oh, there's Tonka. Go ahead, ma'am. Is that to ask a question or to read? You have to.
Just thought I would give you a break and read a little bit.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, this is chapter 47.
The supreme honor and respect. Ananda, prepare me a bed between these twin sal trees with my head to the north. I'm sleepy and would like to lie down. Ananda, these sal trees have burst forth into an abundance of untimely blossom which fall upon the Tathagata's body, sprinkling it and covering it in homage respect. Divine coral tree flowers fell from the sky. Divine sandalwood powder fell from the sky, sprinkling and covering the Tathagata's body in homage respect. Divine music and songs sound from the sky in homage respect to the Tathagata. Never before has the Tathagata been so honored, respected, appreciated, admired, and adored. And yet, Ananda, whatever male or female ordained practitioner, male or female household practitioner resides practicing the teachings properly and perfectly, fulfills the way of the teachings, he or she honors the Tathagata, has deep respect and appreciation, appreciates him and pays him the supreme homage, respect. Therefore, Ananda, we will reside practicing the teachings properly and perfectly fulfill the way of the teachings. This must be your goal and objective.
Perfect. Thank you, Tonka. So here, the Buddha is describing this miracle that occurred. A Buddha doesn't perform but just one miracle during their lifetime. That's typically what they will do, is they will just perform one miracle. They could potentially perform other miracles, but they typically only perform one at the very beginning when they first start to awaken, or they first awaken to enlightenment. And then from that point forward, they don't perform any miracles, because they're not interested in convincing other people that they're actually a Buddha, because it's to their benefit that people don't know that they're a Buddha. Because if you knew somebody was an actual Buddha, you'd probably be on your best behavior around that person. And then that person who is a Buddha wouldn't be able to use one of the best things that they have available to them, which is to observe the quality of their student's mind and then offer teachings to them that will actually help them to be able to get to enlightenment. So if everybody knew who the Buddha was and there was some outward characteristic like a turned ear or turned nose or some mark on the forehead, then it would render this power useless that a Buddha has, which is to be able to observe the condition of their student's mind and then be able to help them with teachings that would actually be helpful for them. So here, this is a miracle that the Buddha didn't perform, but it was one that was occurring, perhaps by the being of God. That's usually who's performing these kind of miracles. Perhaps heavenly beings were doing this kind of thing. But nonetheless, you can see here what a Buddha actually does. Here's this miraculous thing with flowers bursting into blossoms out of season, with sandalwood dropping and sprinkling the body of the Buddha. This great respect and admiration that is occurring because he's an actual Buddha, and it's happening in front of one of his students. There's this divine music and song coming from the sky. But what does the Buddha do? He doesn't have ego. He doesn't have arrogance. He doesn't say like, look at me. Ain't I so great? No, that's not what a Buddha is going to do. He turns it around and then uses it as a teaching. He says, hey, this was really respectful. This is really, people admiring and having this great honor for me. But the way to really honor me, the way to really respect me and show your appreciation is to practice the teachings that I'm sharing. That's what he shares. And he says this in other teachings as well, where people ask him right out, like, how can we respect you? And he basically says, by learning and practicing the teachings, because a Buddha, they don't share the teachings for fame or fortune. Like I mentioned, they do it out of loving kindness and compassion for their students and for the world. And they spend an enormous amount of time, effort, energy, and resources to be able to share their teachings. And the very best way to honor not just a Buddha who is a teacher, but any teacher in the world is to learn and practice what it is that they actually share. That's the way to show them that you value their time and you appreciate what it is that they're actually sharing with you. So that's what the Buddha is sharing here, is that if you really are interested in respecting him and honoring him, to practice his actual teachings, that's what's going to show the most amount of respect and admiration. So let me know what questions you guys have here on this chapter. This is chapter 47, the supreme honor and respect. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So we'll move on to chapter 48. This one is titled Teachings and Discipline Will Be Your Teacher. So again, this is the Buddha preparing to die and kind of letting people know. And Ananda is kind of grieving and like, no, please don't die, right? So the Buddha is sharing this. He says, Ananda, it may be that you will think the teacher's instruction has ceased. Now we have no teacher. It should not be seen like this, Ananda, for what I have taught and explained to you as teachings and discipline will, at my passing, be your teacher. Now, monks, I declare to you, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay. Strive on untiringly. So here, the Buddha's last words, which he must have known were going to be very well studied and understood by people and remembered. His very last words is his very first teaching. The very first teaching that you need to know in order to get on the path to enlightenment is the universal truth of impermanence. If you don't know the universal truth of impermanence, nothing that the teaching that the Buddha taught are going to make any sense to you. That leads into the Four Noble Truths, which is the primary teaching that you're going to need. But the universal truth of impermanence is a building block to help you understand the Four Noble Truths. So he ends his life in the very first place that you need to start in order to actually get on the path to enlightenment, and is explaining that all conditioned things are a nature to decay. Strive on untiringly, continue to go forward and learn and practice the teachings. So here it's important to see that the Buddha is saying all conditioned things are a nature to decay, meaning all conditioned objects are impermanent. Sometimes people think that the Buddha said everything is impermanent, but everything is not impermanent. There are unconditioned objects that are not impermanent. Conditioned objects will arise, change, and fade away. They are impermanent. But there's such thing as an unconditioned object that doesn't arise, it doesn't change, and it doesn't fade away. And this is enlightenment itself and the natural laws of existence. They are unconditioned. They are permanent. So here the Buddha is reminding people, particularly Ananda, to ensure that he uses the teachings to be your teacher, and that they are going to now help you and guide you on this path now that he's dying. So let me know what questions you guys have on this particular chapter. And by the way, I'll show you guys here that I described what final nibbana is. This is something that's helpful for you to understand what is final nibbana, because if you get to enlightenment, it's going to then result in final enlightenment. Then I explain what happens at the time of death. You can see that here. What happens to the mind upon death? If someone attains enlightenment, what happens to the mind? Does it disappear? Is the mind or the soul or spirit the same thing? And then I added this here of how did the Buddha die? This is actually an article from a monk that was ordained at the time that he wrote it, but he was previously a doctor. So he walked through the actual suttas that are describing the Buddha's death, and he narrows it down to a specific cause of death. because one of the things that people misunderstand is they think that the Buddha died from a poisonous sandwich. This isn't actually true. You can actually read all this content here to understand exactly how the Buddha died based on this diagnosis that the doctor has from all the things that he actually saw in the suttas about what happened to the Buddha. You can see all this detail, all this content to be able to help you understand once and for all why the Buddha died and how he actually did that. So if you would ever like to investigate that, it's in this book, and it's in other books too that I have as well, this particular content. So let me know what questions you guys have. You can put it into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask questions if you like. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So we'll move on to the next chapter. Oh, Tonka, you're going to read? Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
All right, let's get down here to the next chapter. Okay, this is chapter 49. Let me see what this one is first, Tonka. Yeah, we could read this one. Let me see. How long is it? You know what? This one is all about ordained practitioners and kind of like how to interact with them. And it talks about like what the ordained practitioners should do when they go to a house and things like that. I'm not sure that we need to read this one. I think you guys can read this on your own. Let's go to chapter 50 and have you read that one, Tonka. Let's see. This one's also for the monks as well. Let's see. Second discourse. We didn't get to these today at the temple. What makes a monk? This one is actually really helpful. Read this one, Tonka, if you like. This one is a really good story and illustrates important teaching.
What makes a monk? Monks, suppose a donkey was following right behind a herd of cattle, thinking, I'm a cow too, I'm a cow too. But his appearance would not be like that of the cow. His whinny would not be like that of the cow, and his footprint would not be like that of the cow. Yet he follows right behind a herd of cattle, thinking, I'm a cow too, I'm a cow too. So too, a monk might be following right behind the community of monks, thinking, I'm a monk too, I'm a monk too. But his enthusiasm to undertake the training in the higher virtues, behavior, moral conduct is not like that of the other monks. His enthusiasm to undertake the training in the higher mind, mental discipline, is not like that of the other monks. His enthusiasm to undertake the training in the higher wisdom is not like that of the other monks. Yet he follows right behind the community of monks, thinking, I am a monk too, I am a monk too. Therefore, monks, you should train yourself thus. We will have a determination, interest to undertake the training in the higher virtues, behavior, moral conduct. We will have a determined interest to undertake the training in the higher mind, mental discipline. We will have a determined interest to undertake the training in the higher wisdom. It is in this way that you should train yourself.
Okay, thank you, Tonka. So here, this discourse is the Buddha describing like, okay, you know, if he's walking as a cow and leaving his footprints into the soft earth, and then there's this donkey behind him putting his footprints into those same his hooves into those same footprints as the cow, and the donkey's thinking, I'm a cow, I'm a cow, I'm a cow, I'm a cow. Is that what makes this being a cow? Well, of course not. Just because the donkey thinks he's a cow doesn't make him a cow, right? So the Buddha is saying what makes you a monk, what makes you an ordained practitioner is that you study the moral conduct, that you study and practice the mental discipline, that you study and practice the higher wisdom. This is the Eightfold Path. The wisdom, moral conduct, and mental discipline of the Eightfold Path. So the Buddha is describing to you that not everyone who wears an orange robe and shaves their hair is a monk. It's based on their actions and what they choose to do. Everyone who wears white clothes and shaves their head isn't necessarily a teacher of the teachings of the Buddha or isn't necessarily practicing the teachings closely. You would like to ensure that if you're looking to people for guidance, that people are actually practicing the teachings, because that's what's going to help you to cultivate the wisdom that you need on the path to enlightenment. So during the lifetime of a Buddha, you can imagine countless people were learning and practicing and were ordained. And nowadays, even here in Thailand, we have about 200 to 300,000 ordained practitioners. But it's not uncommon to see ordained practitioners smoking or hitting animals or kicking animals or doing other unwise things. It's not that uncommon to occasionally see those kinds of things. And when you see those things, you can just understand that this person may be shaving their head, they may be wearing an orange robe, but they're not an actual monk because they're not practicing the teachings closely in the way that the Buddha actually taught. And the Buddha taught to support virtuous practitioners, because any kind of support that you're making in terms of offering, it's going to support an individual who's potentially either sharing the teachings very wisely and helping many people to get to enlightenment, or it's going to those cigarettes or to that gambling or to any other unwholesome things that somebody might be doing. So if you're learning with somebody that you have confidence in and you know that their teachings are very clear and very direct and they're helping you to get to enlightenment, it's those types of people that the Buddha talks about supporting, and those types of people that you would like to come in contact with in order to learn the teachings, because they obviously have made significant improvements in their own life, so you'd be able to learn from them about how to make improvements as well. So let me know if you guys have any questions on this one. We'll just kind of leave it here for the day, because if you guys would like to read any of these other chapters, you can go read them yourself in volume 12. This is chapters 41 through 50. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions anywhere. So what I'm going to do is just end by thanking all of you guys for joining and reminding you guys that next week we're going to be in chapters 51 through, I think this book ends at chapter 64, if I remember correctly. We're going through the next 10 chapters, but if it kind of spills over 3 or 4 chapters, we're going to go all the way through those. I think it ends at chapter 64. So we might actually be finishing up this book next week. So you can take a look and see if you'd like to read before class and or after class. And then tomorrow in our group learning program, I'm going to be sharing chapter 3 in volume 1, which is titled Enlightenment. What is enlightenment? This is where I'm going to teach you all about enlightenment itself and the 4 stages. And then this Monday, I'm going to be starting a Foundation in the Path to Enlightenment course, which is a 5-day course from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And you can learn the foundational teachings to be able to help you firmly get onto the path to enlightenment. And then, of course, on Wednesday, we're going to be in part 4 of our 4-part series of loving kindness meditation. So thank you all for learning, and thank you for your dedication and diligence to develop your life practice. As you need help, feel free to reach out. I'm always here to help you. Perhaps we'll see you guys in one of these future classes. Have a very lovely and wonderful rest of your day. Sawadee Kap. Thank you again for watching. Enjoy your meditation. Look forward to seeing you online and answering any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.